crises are enormous times of growth for most people. And, you know, if I reflect on my life, that's certainly been true for me. So there's something in this time of crisis that creates an opportunity for huge growth and shift in how we are as human beings. So what I'm talking about is the collective rather than the individual. But I think it's really true, and we have crucial choices to make at this time, whether we respond from fear, you know, whether we respond from fear that there's not going to be enough, so we're going to fight people for the less and less oil that is available, or whether we're going to move away from a system that's based on competition and, you know, the power of the strongest to take what they want, to a system that's much more about sharing. And I don't think it's true to say, you know, that sharing isn't in our culture as a value. It's just not kind of celebrated because we have a culture that, you know, outwardly celebrates competition and individualism. So, you know, if we talk more about the enormous amount of sharing and caring for each other that goes on, actually that helps us to see that that is what we're like as human beings. Human beings always want to take care of each other, you know. And I think it's interesting when people reflect on kind of crisis times like the war, the fear is that in a time of difficulty, people will fight each other. But actually what you see is in times of difficulty, people tend to reach out and the best of human nature comes out. And it's really worth remembering, you know, some of those things and seeing the stories and telling each other the stories of what's happened in disasters, how generously people give to each other when the chips are really down and life is at stake, you know. Transition for me has been the thing that has made sense of my whole life, you know. So I've had this odd life where I started out, you know, doing sciences at school, doing an engineering degree, spending a lot of time working in technology and computing. And then I left all of that and had another sort of phase of my life that was very much about exploring the inner world. So I retrained as a psychotherapist, went on a long journey to explore my own inner world. And that's kind of been the focus of the last 10 years of my life. And it always seemed very strange to have these two kind of pieces. In transition, the whole thing makes absolute sense. You know, it's really useful to understand technology and the science and the practicalities of our system, and to be able to look at our systems for living with an analytical, you know, clear thinking, modelling mind, which is what I was trained to do as an engineer, and then to link that up with what's happening inside of us, what's going on in our psychology. Why do we make an industrial growth system that's inherently unsustainable? What can we do about it? So there's something about, and I've had that experience reflected by a lot of people, that transition uses every bit of them, you know, their heart, their head, their hands, you know, every part of them is needed and has a place. So there's something enormously satisfying about that, you know, that I don't just bring a bit of myself to work and have to leave some other part of me behind. The more of myself I bring, the more effective I am. You know, and I think there's something in that about the quality of what transition is trying to get to, which is to create a world where people can be the whole of themselves. You know, you don't have to leave your caring side behind when you go to work. For instance, you don't have to leave your values behind, because your values are absolutely needed to make a good society. So that has been an absolute joy, and it's part of why I do a lot of transition work, even though a lot of it still isn't paid. You know, the satisfaction of that is worth an enormous amount to me. I think the biggest challenge of transition is not to burn out. And I feel that personally, and I see it in many people around me. And it's actually one of the things we talk about a lot on the training, you know, so we do a kind of going forth session at the end. And for some people, what we're encouraging them to change or to think about or to do as their next step is to slow down and do less. And there's something about the field of transition, you know, and you see it in all environmental movements, about the urgency, about the scale of the problems, about how deeply we long for something better. You know, we long for a changed society that calls people to give and give and give. And it's one of the things, you know, that I think I've tried to pay attention to in Totnes, and I've encouraged others to pay attention to, is that we're taking care of ourselves. And if we're not very good at taking care of myself, you know, as I'm sometimes not, we're keeping an eye out for each other. So if I see people that are looking really tired and still, you know, going to more and more meetings or trying to get yet another project to kind of go forward, to really challenge people about that and encourage people to take time out and look after themselves. So what we look at in terms of the wounding, we do a brainstorm at the beginning of the section on the psychology of change. And we ask people to name what they see as the underlying beliefs of the industrial growth system. And we get a similar kind of pattern of beliefs named from all the groups that we work with. So some of the kind of things that come up are all the stuff about growth and progress. Growth is good, growth is inevitable, growth is the only model, there's no other alternative. What you're worth is much more about what you have or how you look or what you do rather than who you are. Something about separation, that human beings are separate from nature, we're more important than nature, you know, we can use nature as we want. And also the hierarchy of power within human beings. So, you know, man over woman, white over black, urban over rural, over indigenous, and so on. And another whole piece about using strength. You know, it's a competitive world, grab your share, fight for it, you know, don't let anybody take yours, rather than cooperation and sharing. And something about power. Sort of power and expertise. I don't know enough to make a decision. You know, the doctor knows best, or the scientist, or the technologist. So we get all of these beliefs named, and what we suggest is that underneath those beliefs is a set of kind of wounds that we have. So things that are painful that we're attempting not to feel. So underneath all the stuff about if I have a big house, if I have a good job, if I have a car, is a feeling that if I'm just myself, I'm not worth much, or I'm not worth enough. So underneath that feeling of worthlessness, and then over the top of that, we create all these compensations. Underneath is a feeling of powerlessness, and we compensate by grabbing as much power as we can and making sure there's somebody who is less powerful than we are. Underneath is the feeling of scarcity. There's not enough, so we've got to make more and more. And then what we actually create is these tremendous excesses. So we create places and lifestyles where people have so much that they can't consume it, literally. You know, we throw away 30% of the food that we buy because we're buying so much that we don't have time to eat it all. So we see these sort of patterns, and then what we do in the talk is to link that with childhood wounding and suggest that there are, you know, you could see this as an addictive pattern which is driven by things that are out of consciousness. So those feelings of dissatisfaction or that the world isn't okay in some way aren't felt, and yet they drive our behaviour, and we can't get to a place of real satisfaction. So our whole system could be seen as a sort of collective addictions process, driven by things that are out of consciousness, with a compulsive pattern cycle that we go round, where, you know, we go for another fix, we go for still more growth, we go for more shopping, more stuff, more cars, you know, more whatever it is, but we never feel satisfied. We never have a feeling that there's enough, or that I'm really worth something, or that I'm really, you know, empowered as a human being, or connected. You know, so separation is one of those. And for many people, that's a really big insight, you know, sometimes into patterns in their own lives, but also into seeing how much of our external world is shaped by what's happening internally. And in particular, you know, as a sort of someone with psychological training, how much of it is shaped by what's out of consciousness. And you know, that's a really useful model to get, because once you know what you're looking for that's out of consciousness, you can see where it's starting to drive your process, where it's actually in charge of what you're doing. And some of that you see reflected in the transition process. So we have, we talk about a sort of comfort zone. So we're not comfortable feeling very painful feelings, and we're not comfortable talking about the really, there isn't even a proper word for it. I haven't even found the right word for the group of these things, but where we are beautiful, generous, loving, caring, the sort of soul qualities, if you like, of human beings. And transition actually recreates that. I think it's really interesting to see that if you want to make spaces in transition to feel the fear or even the terror of how it is to live at a time when you don't know if there's going to be another generation or 2 generations living their lives out on a stable planet, how terrifying that is, or the grief that we feel at losing species and watching, for instance, the polar bears suffering from the loss of ice, or just seeing, our own local environments being affected by climate change or industrialisation. If you try to create spaces to feel those feelings, often in transition people will say that's not positive. We're a movement that's about creating a positive vision of the future, so we don't do that. But it's really important that we include those feelings. That's part of how we know what's going on